I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to reading Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws. Rah, 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 rah. Today we're doing Book 23, which is it is the last of the books of Part 4, which is on the question of commerce. Now, what's so interesting is even though this is about commerce, this book is mostly about commerce, it ends on the question of the number of inhabitants, right? Which seems to not necessarily directly be on commerce. But then again, he seems to suggest that commerce means also interconnection, communication, and therefore the multiplicity, and that the more people you deal with, the more commerce there is. So we get a question about in Book 23 on the laws and their relation to the number of inhabitants, or the population size, the question of population. Now, he starts it out with chapter one. And this is interesting. In chapter one, on man and animals in relation to multiplicity of their species, right? And he gives the quote, Venus, the giver of love. And there's a quote line from this poem, which is, again, I think, if I'm correct, it's Ovid, right? It is, it's Lucretius. It's the beginning of translation of the beginning of Lucretius's De Rerum Neutrala, the first verse, section 6 through 20, right? So, for soon as the years have barred her springtime face, and bars are drawn from the breeze of growth and birth, in heaven the birds first mark your passage, lady, and your flowers pulse in their hearts. Their wild beasts too leap over rich, lush lands, and swift swim, so imprisoned by your charms. They follow lustily where you lead them on, lastly over the sea and hills and greedy rivers, through leaf-laid homes of birds, through fresh green fields. In every creature you sink love's tingling dart, luring them lustily to create their kind. Since you and only you rule the world of nature, and nothing without you comes forth to the coasts of the holy light, or makes the joys and of love. So therefore, this idea that opens with the idea of the goddess virtue, the goddess Venus, the goddess of love, the god of seems to be the god also through love and eros, desire, you get procreation, and procreation provides the futures of peoples, of kinds of of species and animals. The fertility. Now he comes up here, right? And this is now from Lucretius now to Montesquieu. From the fertility of female animals is virtually consistent. But in the human species, the way of thinking, character and passions, fantasies, caprices, and the idea of preserving one's beauty, the encumbrance and pregnancy, that of too numerous families, disturb propagation in a thousand ways. So, even though the nature of animals, in that sense, the fertility of female animals is consistent, humans it's not, because of thinking of what of thinking, character, passions, fantasies, caprices, the idea of preserving our beauty, the encumbrance of pregnancy, that too many, this is too numerous of families. All these things disturb propagation in a thousand ways. He's saying. Now, number two, marriage. The natural obligation of the father to nourish his children has established marriage, which declares one who should fulfill this obligation. The one who should fulfill this obligation, the peoples of whom Pompeius Mela speaks, fixed it by a resemblance alone. So this is the Supta Obis, the Garabanites, right? He talks about among police people. The father is the one whom the law in the ceremony of marriage declares to be such, because they find in him the person they seek. So the idea of the father, right? The question of the father. Well, police people. The father is the one whom the laws in the ceremony of marriage declare this, the obligation to maintain it. Among animals, this obligation is such that the mother can usually meet it. The obligation is much broader among men. Their children partake of reason, but it comes to them by degree. It is not enough to nourish them. They must also be guided. Even when they can sustain their lives, they cannot govern themselves. Right? Therefore, this idea is not that animals can take care of their own. The mother can merely take care of it. Here, it's more complex, and therefore, the children are not able, even when they can, they nourish themselves, they are not able to govern themselves. Right? Illicit unions contribute little to the propagation of the species. In them, the father, whose natural obligation is to nourish and raise the children, is not fixed, and the mother, on whom the obligation falls, meets thousands of obstacles in shame, in remorse, in in the constraints her sex imposes, in the rigor of the laws, and she generally lacks the means of support. So again, this is all these things. Like he talks about the question of this. In other words, illicit unions, and this is kind of like the idea of why marriage is important. This is why marriage matters, because it hurts the children if it isn't. Women who have submitted to public prostitution cannot have the comforts required to raise the children. Even the care required for the education of the children is incompatible with their condition. And they are so corrupt that the laws cannot trust them. It follows from all this that the public continence is joined naturally to the propagation of the species. So, in other words, the public continence this is the consonance means the condition, the health of it, the stability of it, the morality of it, right? In that sense, um, um, that it does not fall into licentiousness and you know illicit behavior, right? So therefore, the continence is correct behavior. It's like controls of moderate behavior, right? Whereas not illicit and not problematic in the sense. It follows. Um, so therefore, this is how he says this. That it's public consonants. Therefore, it's for the sake of the public order, not individual, but public in that sense. Number three, chapter three, on the conditions of children. Reason dictates that children follow from the condition of the father when there is a marriage, and where there is no father, they can only be the concern of the mother. So, okay, the condition of children. If they are marriage, then therefore the father has an obligation to that. But if not, if there's no marriage, there's no father, then the concern of them they can only be the concern of the mother. On family, chapter 4, it is accepted almost everywhere that the wife passes into the family of her husband, So therefore, this is kind of a rule, generally the case. The contrary is established without any difficulty in Formosa, right, where the husband goes to form the wife's family, goes into the wife's family. So most families, it tends to be the wife. The wife goes into the family of the husband's line, but then in Formosa it's the opposite. The men go into the husband goes into the family of the wives. Independently of the first motives, this law, which fixes the family and succession of the person of the same sex, contributes much to the propagation of the human species. The family is a sort of property. A man who has children of the sex that does not perpetuate it is never content until he has those of the sex that does. Names which give men the idea of a thing that seemingly should not perish are very appropriate for aspiring in each family the desire to extend its duration. Among some people, names distinguish families. Among others, they distinguish only persons, which is not as good. So names, this is the idea that names distinguish things. And he just says distinguishes the family, this idea of the family is succession of a generation after generation. It has a past, a present, a future. The individual is just the now. Okay, the individual is just the now, It's the family that has the future. Um, and therefore, this is why that names are both distinguished families and persons, but it's among some peoples, right? Names distinguish families; others they distinguish only persons. And this is only names only distinguish persons. That's not good. It shows that there's something wrong in the society, or that place, right? Or that people. Chapter 5 on the various orders of legitimate wives. Sometimes laws and religion has established many sort of civil unions. For example, among the Mohammedans, where there are several orders of wives whose children are recognized by their birth in the household, by civil contracts, or and even by the slavery of the mother and the subsequent recognition of the father. It would be contrary to reason for the law to stigmatize in the children what it approved in the father. Therefore, all these children should inherit unless some particular reason oppose it, as in Japan, where only the children of a wife given by the emperor may inherit. Policy requires that the goods the emperor gives not be ostensibly divided because they include a service, as did our fiefs in former times. So they don't want to divide them. You don't want to divide them because it meant service had to be given to kings. Right? This is the emperor. Only the there are conditions in which a legitimate wife enjoys within the household nearly the same honors that the single wife has in our climate, where the children of concubines are taken to belong to the first wife. It is established thus in China. Okay, this is therefore the first wife is like the legitimate life enjoys certain things in the household nearly the same honor that the single wife has in our climate, right? In other words, this is the idea that the household woman, the legitimate wife in the household has the same authority, honor as that a single wife in our climate, the European climate. And here goes there, the children of concubines are taking belong to the first one, as established in China. Filial respect, the ceremony of strict mourning, are due not to the natural mother, but to the mother given by the law. So therefore, fidelity respect is not to the natural mother, but to the mother given by law. Who's that? The first, the legitimate wife. Right? With the help of such a fiction, there are no longer bastard children. And in the countries where this fiction has no place, one surely sees that the law that makes legitimate the children of concubines is a forced law, for the largest part of the nation would be stigmatized by the law. Nor is there a question in these countries of children born of adultery, nor is there a question in these countries of children born of adultery. The separation of women, the enclosure, the eunuchs, the locks render the thing so difficult that the law judges impossible. Besides, the same sword would exterminate the mother and the child. Right. So therefore, this is the Mohammedan or the Asian, or when they're separate despotic countries, where they're separated, they're divided, and they're controlled, they're locked. So therefore, there's no question of bastardry in that sense. Chapter 6 on bastards in various governments. Um, um, Therefore, one finds scarcely any bastards in the countries where polygamy is permitted. These are found in those where the laws establish a single wife. So, bastardy is monogamy, right? Concubinage had to be stigmatized in these countries. Therefore, the children born of it had also to be stigmatized. In republics, where it is necessary for Moors to be pure, bastards should be still more odious than there are in monarchies. So in Rome, the provisions made against them were perhaps too harsh, but as the ancient institutions made it necessary for all children to marry, moreover, as marriages were softened by permission to repudiate or to divorce, only a very great corruption of Moors could have brought about concubinage. It must be remarked that because of the esteem accorded to citizenship in democracies, where it carried it with its sovereign powers. Laws were often made about the position of bastards that had less relation to the thing itself and to the honesty of marriage than to the particular constitution of the republic. So therefore, that democracy is in democracy, citizens are sovereigns, are the exercising agents of sovereignty. So bastardry would be counterfeiting sovereignty in that sense, and therefore that's why it's not, the laws are there not to deal with the question of legitimate children and things like this, but to the Constitution of the Republic itself, right? Thus, the people sometimes accept bastards as citizens in order to increase their power against the important men, right? Thus, in Athens, the people subtracted from the bastards from their numbers of citizens in order to have a greater portion of the grain sent to them by the king of Egypt. Finally, Aristotle teaches us that in many towns where there were not enough citizens, bastards inherited. And when there was enough, they did not inherit. Okay, so this is the point about the question of it. In democracies, the acceptance of bastards, whether they are going to be accepted and made allowed to be inherit and have rights versus not, is a political question based on prudence of the time. Now, this is why it's tied to the question of, do they need citizens? Do we need citizens? Is there threats to our? Do we need numbers in order to fight a danger or not? Chapter 7: The father's consent to marriage. The consent of the father is founded on their power, that is, on their right of property. It is also founded on their love, on their reason, and on the uncertainty of the reason of their children. Okay, so therefore, the father's consent is based on property, right? That also love, on reason, on the uncertainty of the reason of the children, whose age kept it in a state of ignorance, and whose passions kept them in a state of drunkenness. Right? In the small republics, or in the singular institutions of which we have spoken, there can be laws assigning magistrates to inspect marriages between the children of citizens, a thing nature has already assigned to fathers. Right? The love of the public good can be such that it equals or surpasses any other love. So the love of the public good, he says. Therefore, in small republics, in republics, or in the singular institutions that we kind of spoken of, right, of this sense, there might be a magistrate who acts like inspects the marriages in that sense. Because why? This is like the love of the public good equals that of, or surpasses the other loves. This is why Plato wanted magistrates to regulate marriage. This is why the Lacedaemonians magistrates directed them. But an ordinary institution is the father to marry their children. Their prudence in this regard will always be greater than any other prudence. Nature gives father a desire to procure heirs for their children, which they scarcely feel for themselves. In the various degrees of primogeniture, they see themselves gradually advancing towards the future. But what would happen if harassment and avarice went into the point of usurping the authority of fathers? Let us listen to Talmage Gage on the conduct of the Spanish in the West Indies. Right? This is Gage's travel to the New Worlds. In order to increase the numbers of the people who pay tribute, all Indians who are 15 years old must marry, and the age of marriage of Indians has been ruled to be 14 years for males and 13 for girls. This is founded on a canon that says that craftiness can replace age. He saw one of these enumerations made. It was a shameful thing, he said. Thus, in the action that should be the freest of the world, the Indians are still slaves. Chapter 8, continuation of the same subject. In England, daughters often abuse the law in order to marry according to their fancy, without consulting their parents. I do not know whether this usage might not be better tolerated there than elsewhere, as the laws have not established a monastic celibacy. Girls have no other state to take than that of marriage and cannot refuse it. On the other hand, in France, monasticism is established. Daughters always have the recourse to celibacy, and the law ordering them to await the consent of their fathers can be more suitable there. Um, the usage in Italy and Spain would be least reasonable in respect to this idea. Monasticism is established there, and one can marry without the father's consent. Right? So, therefore, this example this is that England, no monastery, but they bypass the father consent. In France, well, there's not a problem because but Spain is the case where there is no father consent, but it's also monasticism. Chapter 9 on girls. Girls who are led to pleasure and liberty only by marriage. Those spirits dare not think, those hearts dare not feel, whose eyes dare not see, whose ears dare not hear, who are introduced only to show themselves dull witted, and who are condemned without respite to trifles, and to precepts are quite drawn to marriage. It is the boys who must be encouraged. So therefore, the point is, it is the boy. In other words, it's not girls. The problem is not girls marrying. This is the old problem. It was men who had to be encouraged. We can say maybe today it's the opposite. Once they turn girls into men, then once the girls have become like men, therefore they get the following of men, and now and men are turned into women. That's the as men have been made effeminate, women have been made masculine, and therefore the vices of each gender has come with it. Um, Chapter 10: What induces one to marry? What induces leads one to marry? Whenever there is a place for two persons to live comfortably, a marriage is made. Nature very much inclines to this when she is not checked by the difficulties of sustenance. So therefore, whenever there's a place that they can live comfortably, marriage. Nature inclines this, except, and it only checked as there's difficulty of sustenance. Nascent peoples multiply and increase greatly. In other words, the early peoples, right, the primitive peoples. Right? Among them, it would be a great discomfort to live in celibacy. It is not a discomfort to have many children. Contrary occurs when the nation is formed. So when the nascent peoples at the beginnings, right, the early peoples, primitive people, multiply, increase greatly. He says. Now he says the problem becomes when nations are formed because then, well, it is no longer discomfort to live in celibacy, and too many children can be a discomfort, right? Chapter 11. Again, this is something going on with this. Every chapter 11 has had this error saying, do. So this is really weird. On the harshness of the government. People who have absolutely nothing, like beggars, have many children. This is because their case is like that of nascent people. It costs them nothing for the father to give his art to his children, even at birth have the instruments of that art. These people in a rich or superstitious country might multiply because they do not bear the burdens of the society, but are themselves the burdens of society. Okay, um, but people who are poor only because they live under harsh government, who regard their fields less as their foundation for their sustenance than as a pretext for harassment. These people, I say, have few children. So once you have a situation, they're taxed and they're destroyed. They're not going to have the citizens, these people who have fields and resources, and that these are going to be taken from them. They have few children. These people, they cannot even nourish themselves. How could they do with sharing? They cannot take care of themselves when they are ill. How can they raise creatures who are in continuing needs, which is illness, continued illness, which is childhood? Right? It is ease of speaking and the inability to examine that it has caused it to be said that the poorest the subjects, the larger the families, and the more one is burdened with imposts, the more one puts oneself in a position to pay them. Two sophisms that have always ruined and will ever forever ruin monarchies. Right. This is he says that the larger the families, and therefore that the one is that more the more one is burdened with imposts, the more one puts off in a position to pay. put themselves in the position to pay them. These two sophists must always rule in favor of monarchies. The poorer the subject, the larger the families. That's one. And then the more one is burdened with imposts, the more one puts oneself in a position to pay them. These are two sophists that destroy monarchies. The harshness of the government, the government can go so far as destroying natural feelings by natural destroying natural feelings by natural feelings themselves. Does not the women in America make themselves miscarry in order for their children not to have such cruel masters? Uh, 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 this is the kind of gauge interpreting what that would happen in the Indies, right? The Indians will abort their things rather than bear children to be slaves. Or even this is true with that. Chapter 12 on the number of girls and boys in different countries. As I have said, or as I've already said, that in Europe, a few more boys than girls are born. This is Book 16, Chapter 4, right? That may be no longer true. I will see what this. It has been observed in Japan a few more girls than boys were born. All things being equal, there will be more fertility. There will be more fertile women in Japan than in Europe, and consequently more people. So the question of more women, more fertility, more. On accounts say that in Baton there are 10 girls for every boy. Such a disproportion would make the number of families there to be the number of families in other climates to be 1:5.5 would be excessive. Indeed, families there would be larger, but there are fewer people sufficiently well off to be able to take care of such a large family. So therefore, this idea in that sense of and this is bedtime, right? On chapter 3 on seaports. In seaports where men are exposed to 1,000 dangers and go to live and die in distant climates, there are fewer men than women. Nevertheless, more children are seen there than elsewhere, which is the result of the ease of gaining sustenance. Perhaps, too, the oily part of the fish can supply the matter that serves for procreation. This would be one of the causes for the infinite number of people there are in Japan, right, and China, where they live mostly exclusively on fish. If this were so, certain monastic rules that oblige one to live on fish would be contrary to the spirit of the legislator himself in that sense, right? God himself. This is kind of like a joke. He's making fun of that. So if it's fish, well, maybe there's fish being involved, but then if you're doing monastic orders who require people to live on fish, that's kind of. Chapter 14 on the product of the land that requires more or fewer men. The countries that are in pasture are little populated because few people find occupation there. Lands and grain occupy more men, and vineyards infinitely more. In England, there have often been complaints that the increase in pasture land has led to a decrease in inhabitants. And it observed in France that the great quality of its vineyards is one of the greatest causes of the multitude of men. So therefore, this is actually this is labor. Right? You need labor, you need workers, you need people, and therefore you need people to be there. Countries with coal mines to supply materials or fuel to have an advantage over others, since they do not have any forests and all the lands can be cultivated. In places where rice is grown, there must be many projects to control the water. Therefore, many of the people can be occupied. Furthermore, less land is needed there to provide the sustenance of a family than those countries that produce other grains. Finally, the land that everywhere is used for feeding animals serves immediately, therefore, the sustenance of men. The work that animals do elsewhere is done by men, and the cultivation of the land becomes for men an immense manufacture. This is Book 21. Right, this is the okay. Chapter 13, 15, sorry, on the number of attitudes in relation to the arts. So therefore, if land requires certain things, he says that certain natural agriculture, land, cultivation, certain crops, the different crops with different populations, and that sustenance produces, and also labor, physical labor. The mines produces jobs and opportunities, in and water control for certain crops. This leads to more occupations and therefore more people. More people are needed. More jobs are needed. More work that's needed. More people. Right? There's a connection between occupation and population. Okay, which is interesting. That as technology grows, where we have technology replace people, there's less need for people. Therefore, will population shrink? Chapter 15 on the number of inhabitants in the relation to the arts. When there is an agrarian law and the lands are equally divided, the countries can be heavily populated, although there are few arts, because each citizen finds that working has his land provides him precisely enough to feed himself, and because all citizens together consume all the fruits of the country. It is thus in some ancient republics. But in our states, in our states today, this is 18th century, 18th century, right? The lands are unequally distributed. It produces more fruits than those who cultivate it can consume. And if one neglects the arts and attaches oneself only to agriculture, the country cannot be populated. As those who cultivate or supervise cultivation have fruits remaining, nothing commits them to work the following year. The fruits would not be consumed by idle people, for idle people would not have the wherewithal to buy them. Therefore, the arts must be established in order for the fruits to be consumed by plowmen and artisans. And in a word, these states need many people to grow more than is necessary for themselves. For that, they must be given the desire to have the superfluous. But only artisans can give that. So therefore, the artisan class can make superfluous, the more greater consumption. This idea of consumption, we need to have consumption because the need for consumption, need for arts and crafts and these things. This will produce people who consume the food that we produce. Those machines whose purpose is to simplify the crafts are not always useful. Again, this is the idea that if the work is at a medium price, suitable to both the one who purchases it and the other worker who makes it, machines that would simplify its manufacture, that is, would decrease the number of workers, would be pernicious. And if water mills were not established everywhere, I would not believe them to be as useful as is said, because they have put an infinity of hands to rest. They have deprived many people of their use of the water, and they have made many lands lose their fertility. So therefore, this is a question: is every machine that does done to save labor, is it really doing the benefit, the good that it claims to be? This is actually this is very interesting. This is a critique. Here what we have is the machines whose purpose is to simplify the crops are not always useful. If the price of it makes sense, and why doing it? You just you're just removing the things, and it actually may cause problems. Like the example of the mills, right? The water mills, they not only make a whole bunch of people idle, they also then just remove, frustrate the water that would make other the lands themselves live off fuel. Chapter 16 on the views of the legislature concerning the propagation of the species. Regulation concerning the number of inhabitants depend greatly on the circumstances. There are countries where nature has done everything. The legislature, therefore, has nothing to do. So, therefore, there's circumstances. In other words, the regulations concerning the inhabitants is circumstances. Some countries, nature does everything, and therefore, they have legislated nothing. What good is it for the laws to encourage propagation when fertility of a climate gives enough people? Sometimes the climate is more favorable than the terrain. The people multiply, the famines destroy them. This is the situation in China. Thus, a father there sells his daughter and exposes the children. The same cause brings about the same effect in Tonkin. And one must not, like the Arab traveler who appeared in Rindunt's account, seek to explain it by the option on metaphysics, metatempsychosis. Yeah, this is the. What is that? What is metatempsychosis? This is. Yeah, the supposed transmigration of death of the soul to a human being or animal life to new bodies. In other words, this idea. Uh, 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 um, for the same reason, the religion of the island of Formosa did not permit women to have children before they are 35 years old. Before this age, priestess crush their womb and make them miscarry. So this is a very interesting idea. Is that this is the again? This is that they need to restrain the population. Right? Chapter 17 on Greece and the number of its inhabitants. This effect, which depends on physical causes in a certain eastern country, was produced in Greece by the nature of the government. The Greeks were a great nation made up of towns, each having its government and its laws. They were conquered no more than the towns of Switzerland, Holland, and Germany do today. In each republic, the legislature had for its own purposes the happiness of the citizens at home and a power abroad that was not inferior to that of the neighboring towns. With a small territory and a great felicity, it was easy for the number of citizens to increase and become a burden. Thus, they constantly made colonies. They were mercenaries like of the Swiss today. Nothing was neglected that could prevent the excessive multiplication of children. There were among them they were among the republics whose constitution was singular. Subject peoples were obliged to supply sustenance to the citizens. The Macedonians were fed by the Helots, the Cretians by the Percoli, the Thessalians by the Penasoi. There had to be only a certain number of freemen so that the slaves would be in a position to furnish their sustenance. We say today the number of regular troops must be limited. Lacedaemon was an army kept up by the peasants. Therefore, this army had to be limited. If not, the freemen who had all the advantages of society would have multiplied without number, and the plowmen would have been overwhelmed. The Greek political men were thus particularly attached to regulating number of citizens. Plato fixes that 5,040 at 5,040, and he wants propagation to be checked or encouraged according to the need, by honors and by shame and by warnings of the old men. He even wants the number of marriages to be regulated in such a way that the people replace themselves without overburdening the republic. If the laws of the country, say Aristotle, prohibit the exposing of infants, the number of children each man is to beget has to be limited. To someone who has more children than the number specified by the law, he counsels causing the woman to miscarry before the fetus has life. So abortion, baby, abortion. The vile means employed by the Cretians to prevent having too many children is reported by Aristotle, and I have felt modestly frightened when I wanted to report it. This is Aristotle's Politics 1272a 2426. Right? He's not going to report it. I'm just going to make reference to it. I'm not going to give it. Right? There are places, Aristotle goes and say, where the laws make citizens of foreigners bastards, or those who are born only of a citizen mother. But as soon as they have enough people, they no longer do it. The savages of Canada burn their prisoners, but when they have an empty hut to give, they recognize their prisoner as part of their nation. Sir William Petty had assumed in his calculation that a man in England is worth what he would be sold in Algiers. Right? This is a famous economist doing this, right? 60 pounds sterling, right? This is that idea that this is this can only be good in England. There are countries in which a man is worth nothing. There are some in which he is even worth less than nothing. So therefore, it's kind of a joke. They say, "Well, this argument is for 60-some pounds sterling." Well, that's only good in England, because there are some countries where men are worth nothing, and some countries where men are worth even less than nothing. That's even interesting in that sense. Chapter 18, on the state of peoples before Romans. Italy, Sicily, Asia Minor, Spain, Gaul, Germany, like Greece, were full of small peoples and glutted with inhabitants. In them there were no need to make laws to increase their numbers. Chapter 19, Depopulation of the Universe. All these small republics were swallowed up by a great one, and the universe was gradually seen to lose population. One only has to look at Italy and Greece before and after Roman victories. I shall be asked, says Livy, where the Volscians were able to find enough soldiers to wage war after being vanquished so often. There has to have been an infinity of people in these regions today, which today would be uninhabited except for some soldiers and Roman slaves. The oracles have ceased, says Plutarch, because the places where they spoke have been destroyed. In Greece today, one would find scarcely 3,000 soldiers. I shall not describe, says Sabro, Epirus and the neighboring places, because these countries are entirely uninhabited. This depopulation, which began long ago, continues every day, so that Roman soldiers camp in abandoned houses. He finds the cause of this in Polybius, who says that Aemilius Paulus destroyed 70 towns in Epirus after his victory and returned home with 150,000 slaves. So basically the enslavement. There were populations of people who were enslaved and made Roman slaves and were basically forced to labor in the mines and the mines and fields and like this, and they basically died out and they didn't populate. It was necessary for the Romans to make laws for the propagation of the species. It says that, right? The Romans, by destroying all the peoples, destroyed themselves. Constantly active, striving, and violent, they wore themselves out, just as a weapon that is always in use wears out. I shall not speak here of their attentiveness to replacing citizens they lost, of the association they made, of the rights of citizens they gave, or that of the immense nursery of citizens they found in their slaves. I shall say what they did. I shall say what they did to replace not the loss of citizens, but that of men. And as they were people in the world who best knew how to fit their laws to their projects, to estimate what they did in this regard is not a matter of indifference, right? So therefore, they didn't replace citizens. They made ways to give citizenship, and they took from slaves, made citizens. But that's not even propagation. This is saying this is the way they needed people. Chapter 21, the Roman laws concerning the propagation of species. The old Roman laws sought to induce the citizens to marry. The Senate and the people often made regulations about this, as Augustus says in the speech reported by Dio. Dionysius of Heliocrasenos and Assos cannot believe that after the death of 305 Fabians wiped out by the Venetians, there remained of his family but a single child, because the old law that ordered each citizen to marry and raise all his children was still in force. Independently of the law, the censors kept an eye on marriage, and according to the need of the republic, they engaged people to it both by shame and by penalties. Right, the Moors, which had begun to be corrupted, contributed much to citizens' distaste for marriage, which is only trouble for those who are no longer sensitive to the pleasures of innocence. In other words, this is only trouble the Moors of this that are no longer sensitive to the pleasures of innocence. This is the spirit of the speech that Metellus Numidicus made to the people during his censorship. If it were possible not to have wives, we would be delivered from this evil. But as nature has established that one can scarcely live happy with them, or continue to exist without them, there must be more regard for our preservation than for fleeting satisfactions. Right? This shows how much their distrust of family life, marriage, and children led them to. The corruptions of the Moors destroyed the censorship itself, established to destroy the corruption of Moors. Right, the censorship was designed to destroy the corruption of Moors, but the corruption of Moors destroyed the censorship. But when this corruption becomes general, censorship is no longer has any force. Civil discords, triumvirates, the prescriptions weakened Rome more than any war had it that it had yet more than in other words the civil discords, civil wars, the triumvirates, the prescriptions. This weakened Rome more than any wars that it had yet waged. Few citizens remained, and most of them were not married. In order to remedy the ill, Caesar and Augustus reestablished censorship, and even wanted to be censors. They made various regulations. Caesar rewarded those who had many children. He forbid women under 45 and who had neither husband nor children to wear precious stones or to use litters, and an excellent method of attracting celibacy through venality. Uh, the laws of Augustus were more pressing. He imposed new penalties on those who were not married, increased the rewards for those who were, and for those who had children. Tacit calls them the Julian laws. It is likely that the old regulations made by the Senate, the people, and the censors were recast into them. The Augustan law met with 1,000 obstacles, and 34 years after it had been made, the Roman knights asked him to revoke it. He had those who were married put on one side and those who were not on the other. These last appeared great number, which astonished and confused the citizens. Augustus, gravity, with the gravity of the censors of old, spoke to them thus: "While diseases and wars take so many citizens from us, what will become of the towns if marriages are no longer contracted? The city does not consist in houses, porticos, public squares. It is men who make the city. You will not see men emerge from the earth to take care of your business, as in legends. It is not to live alone that you remain celibate. Each one of you have companions at his table and his bed. You seek only peace in your profligacy. Will you cite the example of the Vestal Virgins? If you were not to observe the laws of modesty, you would have therefore to be punished as they are. You are equally bad citizens wherever anyone imitates your examples or no one follows it. My only purpose is to perpetuate the republic. I have increased the penalties for those who have not obeyed, and with regard to rewards, they are such I do not know whether virtue has ever had greater ones. If lesser ones lead to 1,000 peoples, if lesser ones lead to 1,000 people to risk their lives, would not these of mine get you to promise to take a wife and nourish your children? This is again. He gave this law, which he named Julia after himself, and for Papeo, for those who were the consuls for a part of that year. The size, the size of the ills appeared even in their election. Dio tells us that if tell us that they were not um, they were not married, and that they had no children. The Augustan laws promptly became a code of laws and symbolic body of all the regulations that could be made on the subject. The Julian laws were recast into them and were given more force. They have to, they have so many aspects. They influence so many things that they form the finest parts of the Roman civil laws. Scattered bits of them are still found in the previous fragments of Lucia, which is the famous law 53, right? 53, that's, yeah, the compagment of the fragments. And the laws of the digest, drawn from the authors who have written on the Papian laws, and the historians and other authors who have cited them. in the Theodosian Code, and the fathers who collected them, doubtless with a commendable zeal for things of the next life, but with very little knowledge of the business of this one. So therefore, he's saying that they're scattered bits and got into these things, and they were collected by people who had cared more for the next life than this life. These laws had several articles, of which 35 are known. But proceeding to my subject as directly as possible, I shall begin with the articles that of Ellis Gelinus, Gelinus tells us the seventh, and which concerns the honors and rewards granted by the laws. The Romans who came for the most part from the Latin towns, which were Lacedaemonian colonies, and those who had even drawn a part of their laws from the towns, had, like Lacedaemonians, the respect for old age that gives it all honors and all precedences. When the Republic lost citizens, marriage and numbers of children were granted the prerogatives that had been given to age. Some were attached to marriage alone, independent of the children who could be born of it. This was called the right of husbands. Others were given to those of citizens with children, others greater ones with those with 3 children. These 3 things must not be confused. Some of the privileged married people could always enjoy, for example, a particular theater. Some they enjoyed only when people who had children, and then those who had more than they did not take them away. So therefore, these privileges were very extensive. The married people who had the greatest number of children was always preferred, both in the pursuit of honors and the exercise of the same honors. The consuls who had the most children took the fasces first. He had the choice of the provinces. The senator who had the most children was first inscribed in the catalogue of senators. He gave his opinions first in the Senate. One could obtain magistracies before the required age because each child counted for an additional year. If one had 3 children in Rome, one was exempt from all personal charges. Free women who had three children and freed women who had 4 came out of that perpetual wardship in which old Roman law kept them. So therefore, 3 or 4 children, they were no longer under the fathers and husbands' control. But if there were rewards, there were also penalties. Those who were not married could receive nothing from the testaments of those who were not relatives, and those who were married but without children received only half. The Romans, according to Plutarch, married in order to be heirs, not in order to have heirs, to be heirs, right? Have heirs. The benefits of a husband and a wife could give to each other by testament was limited by law. They could give each other everything if they had children by each other. If they had none, they could receive a tenth of the inheritance because of marriage. And if they had children from another marriage, they could give each other as many tenths as they had children. If the husband absents himself from his wife for the cause other than business of the republic, he could not be an heir. If the law gave a surviving husband or wife 2 years to remarry, in a year and a half in case of a divorce, fathers who did not want to marry their children or give dowries to their daughters were constrained to do so by the magistrates. One could not have an engagement when the marriage was to be more than 2 years away. And as one could not marry a girl before 12 years of age, one could not become engaged to her before she was 10 years of age. The law did not want one to be able to enjoy uselessly, and on the pretext of an engagement, the privilege of married people. They did not. They didn't want to have the pretext of marriage, but not the marriage, right? And a man of 60 years was prohibited from marrying a woman of 50. and one had a great, in other words, and a man of 60 years was prohibited from marrying women of 50, and one had given great privilege to married people. The laws did not want useless marriages. For the same reason, Senate consuls Calvinicus Annus, Calvinus Annus, declared irregular the marriage of a woman of more than 50 years with a man of less than 60, so that a woman more than 50 could not marry without incurring the penalties of these laws. Tiberius increased the severity of the papal laws and prohibited a man of 60 from marrying a woman who was under 50. So a man of 60 could not marry in any case without incurring the penalty. But Claudius repealed what had been done under Tiberius in this regard. All these provisions were more in conformity. All these provisions were more in conformity with the climate of Italy than with that of the North, when a man of 60 is still strong and women of 50 are not generally barren. In order for one not to be uselessly limited in the choice one could make, Augustus permitted all freemen who were not senators to marry freedwomen. The Papian laws prohibited senators from marrying women who had been freed or who had appeared in the theater, and at the time of the Lupian freedmen were prohibited from marrying women who had led a dissolute life, who had appeared in the theater, or who had been condemned by public judgment. Some Senate consult had to have established this. In other words, this is a rule, this procedure, right? In other words, dissolute life, public public theater, or condemned by the public, right? Um, um, uh, in the time of the Republic, few of these sorts of laws were made, because the censors corrected in this regard the disorder that arose and kept them from arising. So that the empire needed laws, the Republic had to censor. As Constantine had made a law which included for the prohibition of the Palpian laws not only senators, but also those who had considerable rank in the state, not to mention those who were of inferior condition. This formed the right of that time. Only freemen, included in the laws of Constantine, were forbidden such marriage. Justinian also repealed the laws of Constantine and permitted all sorts of persons to contract these marriages. It is in a way that we have acquired such a sorry liberty. Okay. In other words, that there was rules, restraints. Now that Justinian kind of repealed the other laws. It is clear that the penalties imposed on those who married contrary to prohibition of the law were the same as the ones imposed on those who did not marry at all. These marriages gave them no civil advantages. The dowries were null and void after the death of the wife. As Augustus had awarded to the public treasury the inheritance and legacies of those the law declared disqualified from taking them. These laws appeared to be fiscal rather than political or civil. The distaste one already had for the seemingly oppressive burdens was increased by that of seeing oneself constantly prey of the avidity of the fiscs, the financial people, the fiscal officer. The result was that under Nero, one was obliged to modify these laws. That Nero decreased the rewards given those who were informed of the fiscs, that Trajan checked their banditry, that Severus modified these laws, and that the jurists regarded them as odious and abandoned this rigor in their decisions. So therefore, this is really the argument was that these laws were mostly used to take money to the treasury, and therefore were banditry. And this is why different emperors modified them, restrained them, restricted them. Besides, the emperors weakened these laws by giving away as privileges the right of husbands, of children, of 3 children. They did more. They relieved individuals from penalties of these laws. but it seemed that relief should not have been permitted from the rules established for public utility. In other words, this is the danger. The emperor started giving these grants of rights and immunities from the laws, and therefore this not everyone was under the law in that sense, and therefore these laws were for the public, for the sake of the public good, now were kind of useless in that sense. It had been reasonable to grant the right to those with children to the Vestals, whom religion necessary kept virginal. Similarly, one kept the privilege of married men to soldiers because they could not marry. It was custom to exempt the emperor from the annoyance of certain civil laws. Thus, Augustus was exempt from the annoyance of the laws that limited the faculty of freeing, and from the one that set bounds on the faculty of making testaments. Right. All of these were one particular case, but subsequently relief was given readily, and the rule became only an exception. In other words, was everything else was exceptions, right? Actually, the exception became the rule in that sense, right? And then only the rule became that what was the rule was the exceptional situation. Sects of philosophy had already introduced into the empire a spirit of distance from public business, which could not have reached this point at the time of the Republic, where everyone was busy with the art of war and peace. In other words, this is Stoicism. This is Montesquieu's kind of criticism of scholastic philosophy, which is apolitical and is otherworldly, is transcendent. He says, from it came an idea of an idea of perfection attached to all that leads to a speculative life. From it came distance from the cares and innumerance of family. The Christian relating, succeeding philosophy fixed, so to speak, ideas for which the former had only cleared the way. In other words, Stoicism, Stoic philosophy created the problem, and Christianity just followed in the pathway of Stoicism. Christianity gave its character to jurisprudence, for empire always has some relation to priesthood. This can be seen in Theodotus's Code, which is but a compilation of the ordinance of the Christian emperors. One of the eulogists of Constantine said of the emperor, "Your laws were made only to correct vices and to regulate mores. You have removed the artifices of the old laws, which seem to have no other view than that of setting traps for simplicity." It is certain that Constantine's changes were based either on the ideas related to the establishment of Christianity or on ideas drawn from its perfection. From the first purpose came those laws which gave such authority to bishops that they were founded of ecclesiastic jurisdiction. From it came those laws that weakened parental authority by removing from the father the ownership of children's goods. In order to spread a new religion, one must take away the extreme dependence of children, who are always less concerned with what is established. So, therefore, the spread of new religions, one must take away the extreme dependence of children, give independence to children, liberate the children. Whoa! Right? This is the laws made with Christian perfection as their object were chiefly those by which he removed the penalties of the papal laws, which exempted from them both those who were not married and those who, being married, had no children. So this is celibacy conceptions, right? These laws were established, as the ecclesiastic historian says, an ecclesiastic historian, as if the multiplication of mankind could be a result of our cares, instead of seeing that this number grows larger or smaller according to the order of providence. So, the principle of religion has greatly influenced the propagation of the human species. Sometimes they have encouraged it, as among the Jews, the Mohammedans, the Gilberts, and the Chinese. Sometimes they have run counter to it, as they did among the Romans who became Christian. So therefore, the Romans who became Christian, they kind of reduced the population in that sense, right? One continued to preach continence everywhere, that is, the virtue which is more perfect, because by its nature it must be practiced by very few people. Right? Constantine did not remove the decimal laws, which gave greater extent to, in other words, which gave greater extent to the gift a husband and a wife could make to each other in proportion to the number of their children. Theodotus the Young repealed these laws, right? So therefore, in other words, how much money a husband and wife could give depended on how many children they have. Right? Justinian declared valid all the marriages that Papian laws prohibited. These laws wanted one to remarry. Justinian granted advantages to those who would not remarry. By the old laws, the natural faculty that each one had to marry and have children could not be taken away. Thus, the ones received a legacy on condition that one did not marry. When a patron made his freeman swear that he would not marry and that he would not have children, the Papian law annulled both this condition and the oath. Right. Therefore, the provisos upon remaining widowed that we have established contradict the old right and descends from the constitution of the emperors, which were based on ideas of perfection. In other words, the Christian ideas of perfection in a sense. There are no laws containing an express repeal of the privileges and honors of pagan Romans had granted for marriages, and for some number of children. But where celibacy was preeminent, marriage could no longer be honored. And as one could oblige the tax collectors to renounce so much profit without penalties, so much profit when penalties were abolished, one senses that it was easier yet to remove the rewards. So it was easier. You couldn't, in other words, because there was the penalty. In other words, the tax collectors were not going to renounce the penalties; they were going to renounce the rewards, right? Because it's easier. That's money. The penalties raise money. So marriage no longer honored, one could oblige the tax collector to renounce so much profit when how could do this, right? Were abolished. Penalties were abolished. One senses that it was easier to remove the rewards. The same reason of spirituality that permitted celibacy soon imposed the necessity of that celibacy. God forbid that I should speak here against against the celibacy that religion has adopted. But who could be silent about the one formed by libertinage? Who could be silent by the one formed libertinage? The one where two sexes corrupting one another even by mutual feelings themselves. Okay, the one by libertinage, one where two sexes corrupting one another even by natural feelings themselves. Flee a union that should make them better in order to live in one that makes them even worse. It is a rule drawn from nature that the more one decreases the number of marriages that can be made, the more one corrupts those that are made. The fewer married people there are, the less fidelity there is in marriage. Just as just as when there are more robbers, there are more robberies. So he ends 21 on this idea, this Doc idea. This is critical of Christianity in that sense, particularly how Christianity is practiced in the Roman world, how it leads to kind of perversions in the sense. It becomes unnatural, becomes destructive to the population. And therefore, it actually destroys the thing. It turns, like he says, the metaphor here is that celibacy becomes something that corrupts, right? It destroys marriages in that sense. That it corrupts the marriages and creates, and the few married people, there's less fidelity in marriage. And therefore, as there's more robbers, there's more robberies, right? Saying. On chapter 22, the first Romans had a very good police concerning the exposure of children. Romulus says Dionysius of Heracleonasus imposed on all citizens the necessity of raising all male children and the oldest daughter. If the children were deformed and monstrous, he permitted them to be exposed after they had been shown to at least 5 closest neighbors. Romulus did not permit killing any children under the age under 3 years. In that way, he reconciled the law which gave fathers the right of life and death over their children, and the one that prohibited them from being exposed. One also finds in Dionysius of Heracleonasus that the law which ordered citizens to marry and raise their children was in force in Rome year 277, which is 477 BC. One sees that usage had restrained the laws of Romulus that permitted exposing younger daughters. We know what the law of the 12 tables of Rome in year 301, 453 BC, enacted about exposing children only from the passage in Cicero, who, while speaking of the tribunate of the people, says that it was suffocated immediately after its birth, like the monstrous child in the laws of the 12 tables. Therefore, children who were not monstrous were kept. The laws of the 12 table changed nothing of the former institution. The Germans, says Tacitus, did not expose their children. The good Moors have more force among them than the good laws elsewhere. Therefore, among the Romans, there were laws against this practice, and they were no longer followed. No Roman law can be found that permits exposing children. It is doubtless that abuse introduced in later times when luxury took away comfort. When wealth was shared, that wealth was shared was called poverty. When a father believed he had lost what he had given to his, in other words, when a father believed he had lost what he had given to his family, and when he made a distinction between his family and his property. Right? This is that idea that this is the danger of that situation. And he praises the Germanic peoples better than the Romans in that sense. Chapter 23, in the state of the universe after the destruction of the Romans. The regulations made by the Romans to increase the number of citizens had their effect while their republic, in the full force of institution, had only to recover from the losses due to its courage, its audacity, its firmness, its love of glory, even its virtue. But soon the wisest laws could not reestablish what a dying republic, a general anarchy, a military government, a harsh empire, a haughty despotism, a weak monarchy, and an inane, idiotic, and superstitious court had by turns beaten down. One would have said that they had conquered the world only to weaken it and to deliver it defenseless to the barbarians. This is a devastating criticism. They would have had conquered the whole world only to weaken it and deliver it defenseless to the barbarians. The Germans of the nations of the Goths, the Gatia, the Saracens, and the Tartars, each in turn bore down on them. Soon the barbarian peoples had only barbarian peoples to destroy. Thus, in legendary times, after the flood and storms, armed men came out of the ground who did away with each other. Right. This is from Hesiod. Right. This is chapter 24. Changes that occurred in Europe in relation to the number of inhabitants. In the state Europe was at the time, no one could have believed that it could reestablish itself. Above all, when under Charlemagne it had formed only one vast empire. But the nature of the government of that time divided Europe into an infinity of small sovereignties. And as the Lord liveth in his village or of his town, he was not great, rich, powerful. What shall I say? As he was kept secure only by the number of his inhabitants. Each strove with a singular tenderness to make his little country flourish. This succeeded so well that, in spite of the regularities of the government, the lack of knowledge that has since been gained about commerce, the great number of wars, the quarrels which constantly arose. There were in most there were in most of the regions of Europe more people than there are today. I do not have to treat this matter in depth. I shall only cite the prodigious army of crusaders made up of all kinds of men. Mr. Pufendorf says that under Charles the Ninth, there were only 20 million men in France. If it is the perpetual unions of so many small states that produce this decrease, formerly each village in France was a capital. There is only one large one today. Each part of the state was its center of power. Today, everything relates to one center, and this center is, so to speak, the state itself. So there was that when everything was diverse. That this is a very interesting argument. The large centralized structure leads to when a, a, a network of smaller states that are local things. This leads, with the rulers whose power rests on the people, leads to a flourishing and diversity of people. But when there's one central state or one central capital and one central core, and all the elites' power is there, what ends up happening is the population decreases. Interesting point. Chapter 25. Continuation of same subject. It is true that Europe has for 2 centuries greatly increased its navigation. This has both gained and lost inhabitants. Holland sends a great number of sailors to the Indies each year, of which only 2/3 return. The remainder perish or settle in the Indies. Nearly the same thing should happen in the other nations that engage in this commerce. One must not judge Europe as if it were a single state, which alone sends its fleets there. Such a state would increase its people because all the neighboring nations would come to take part in this navigation. Sailors would arrive from every direction. Europe separated from the rest of the world. Europe is separated from the rest of the world by religion, by vast seas, by deserts. Does not replenish itself in this way. So Europe separated by the seas. Therefore, this is what Europe separated by the rest of the world by religion, by vast seas, by deserts. One does not replenish itself in this way. So therefore, sailors come in there and like this idea that such a state would increase the people because neighboring would can take part in navigation. But he says this, Europe, it doesn't happen that way for some reason. Consequently, 26. From all of this, one must conclude that Europe today is an instance of the case in which laws are needed to favor propagation of the human species. Thus, just as the Greek political men always tell us that the republic is tormented by having a large number of citizens, today political men tell us only of the means proper for increasing it. Chapter 27, on the laws made in France to encourage propagation of the species. Louis XIV ordered certain pensions of those who had 10 children and a large one for those who had 12. But it was not a question of rewarding prodigies. In order to give a certain general spirit that would lead to the propagation of species, general rewards and general penalties had to be established, as among the Romans. Chapter 28, how can one remedy depopulation? When very much a question that we should look at, right? When a state is depopulated by particular accidents, war, plagues, or famines, there are resources. The remaining men can preserve the spirit of work and industry. They can seek to undo their misfortune and become more industrious by their calamity itself. An almost incurable ill is seen when depopulation is of long standing because of the internal vice and bad government. Okay, and a bad government. So therefore, the population is happening because of vice and bad government. Men there have perished from the imperceptible and habitual illness, born in languor and poverty, in the violence or the prejudices of the government. They have seen themselves destroyed, and often without seeing the cause of their destruction. Those countries desolated by despotism or by the excessive advantage of the clergy over the laity are examples of this. So, therefore, with the clergy, two things: the countries. This is example of men susceptible illnesses, born in languor and poverty and violence or the prejudice of the government. They have seen themselves destroyed without knowing the cause of their destruction, and those countries desolate. Those countries desolated by despotism or by the excessive clergy, advantages of clergy over laity are examples of this. So therefore, the clergy has more advantages of this despotism aspect, this poverty. Okay? In order to establish a country thus depopulated, one would wait in vain for the help of children who might be born. Time has run out. Men in their isolation lack courage and industry. Without enough land to nourish a people, with enough land to nourish people, one can scarcely nourish a family. In these countries, the common people have no share even in no share even in their poverty. That is to say, in the foul lands with which the country are filled. The clergy, the prince, the towns, and important men, and some principal citizens have gradually become owners of the whole region. It is uncultivated, but the ruined families have left their pastures to them, and the working man has nothing. In this situation, one would have to do throughout the empire what the Romans did in part of theirs. That is, practice in the shortage of inhabitants what they observed in their plenty. Distribute the land to all the families who have nothing. Provide them with the means of clearing them and cultivating them. This distribution should be made until the last man gets a share, so that not a moment of work is lost. So therefore, this is a radical. It says in a situation where the land is empty, hardly because the rich people are there, the wealthy people in the cities in power just let the land advantage. They don't care for it. In this situation, there should be kind of a revolution. The people, the government, or the prince should do what? He should take away all that empty land and divide it up to give it to the people, so that everyone gets some land, enough that they can cultivate it, clear it, cultivate it. Everyone has nothing. Provide them with the means for clearing the lands and cultivating the land, and therefore developing and that. So therefore, this leads to more profit, more growth. Chapter 9 on poorhouses. A man is not poor because he has nothing, but because he does not work. The one who has no goods and who works is as comfortable as the one who has 100 ecus of revenue without working. Whoever has nothing and has a craft is no poorer than he who has 10 acres of land of his own and who has to work them to continue to exist. The worker who has given his art to his children for his inheritance has left them a good which multiplies in proportion to their number. This is not the same for the one who has 10 appurts of land to live on and divide them among his children. In commercial countries, where many people have only have sorry, in commercial countries where many people have only their art, the state is often obliged to provide for the needs of the old, the sick, and the orphan. A state with a good police draws upon the arts themselves for the sustenance. It gives some the work for which they are capable, and it teaches others to work, which already makes work. A few arms given to a naked man in the street does not fulfill the obligation of the state, which owes all its citizens an assured sustenance, nourishment, and suitable clothing, and a kind of life which is not contrary to health. So there's this idea that there's that some does not fulfill the obligation of a state. Um, um, Ogorambus, who's this? 122. Oh yeah, the voyages of Persia, right? Oh, the Persian king. Algorazeb, who was of whom one asks why did he not build poorhouses? He says, says, I shall make in my empire so rich that it will not need poorhouses. He should rather have said, I shall begin by making my empire rich, and I shall build poorhouses. When the wealth of a state, the wealth of a state presupposes such much industry. When there are where there are such a great number of branches of commerce, it is not possible for some branches not to suffer, and consequently for its workers not to be in some temporary necessity. It is then that the state needs to bring help promptly, whether to keep these people from suffering or to avoid their rebellion. It is this situation that there must be poorhouses or some equivalent regulation which can prevent that distress. But when a nation is poor, individual poverty deprives from the general distress and is, so to speak, the general distress. All the poor houses in the world cannot cure that individual poverty. On the one hand, the spirit of laziness that pure houses inspire increased general poverty, and consequently that of the individual. When Henry VIII wanted to reform the Church of England, he destroyed the monks, a nation in itself lazy, and one that maintained the laziness of others because they practiced hospitality, and the and infinity of idle people, gentlemen and bourgeois, spent their lives running from monastery to monastery. He took away the poorhouses where the common people found their sustenance, as the gentlemen found theirs in their monasteries. After these changes, the spirit of commerce and industry became established in England. So Henry destroys the monasteries and destroys the poorhouses. Why does he do this? To create commerce, to get people to do work, to counter the illegacy in that sense. And Roman poorhouses made it so that everyone lives well except those who work, those who are industrious, those who cultivate the arts, those who have land, those who engage in commerce. So those who were the poorhouses destroyed, made everyone lives well, except those who work, those who are industrious, those who are arts, those who have land, those who engage in commerce. So it's counterproductive. As I have said, that wealthy nations need poorhouses because fortune was subject to 1,000 accidents. But one feels that short-term help would be preferable to perpetual establishment. The ill is temporary. Help must be of the same nature and applicable to the particular accident. So therefore, not perpetual institutions, short assistance. He's saying this is very interesting. You're going to help poor people. It's like this. You give them short-term help. You don't create permanent systems. You create permanent systems. This creates laziness. This creates incentives counter that to the forces of industry. Okay, and this is where we end the book here. So this is with this we stop. We finished the part 4. Next, we will turn to book 24, which is part of the 3 books on part 5. So we'll stop and remember this is the last book, part 5 and part 6, the last 2 parts. We end it. So therefore, if you have any comments or questions, please put them below. If you have anything you want to say or add, please put it there. The comments that there. I know this is gonna be a long video, so you're gonna say, "Oh, yeah, it's too long. Your videos are too long." Please like it if you like this video. See, okay, I criticize myself. Don't like it because it's too long. You can say no. Put your comments. If you're gonna say no, why you didn't like it, put or criticism saying, "Oh, your videos are too long." Again, what I'm doing here is not just video. This is going through the chapter with you. So I'm reading this with you, so you can listen to me say this horrible voice before you can go listen to this and kind of like understand the text, reading through the text, understanding the text in these questions. This is very interesting. A lot of good, interesting thoughts in Montesquieu in this regard about laziness, about commerce, and why you engage it like this, and the populations growth and population declining. If you have not subscribed, subscribe. Encourage others to subscribe. I feel like this is going to be useless. Next thing I need you to do is if you want to follow me on social media, links are below. If you want to help me do what I do here, you can do so by through subscribe to our Patreon or through purchasing one of my books, or you can send me a check. Okay, I'm laughing. No one is so far. No one is in Patreon or subscribe star because if I'm getting it for free, why should I help? Okay, this is I did this too late. I should have done this 10, 20 years ago before the algorithm systems come up and this was starting. But, I didn't know better and I wasn't comfortable doing these kind of things. I just decided to do this because I just was so sick of seeing the crap that's on there about political theory. Um, Here's another thing, so please do that. The Montesquieu continuation with on chapter 24 next will be again Mondays and Wednesdays. Montesquieu will be on Monday, Wednesday. Remaining, is it? We have 7 more books left to do this, so that's the schedule for that. And then on Tuesdays and Thursdays, um, we do the contemporary political thinkers. We're wrapping up Kojev. We'll soon be wrapping up Kojev. By the time you see this, I think Kojev should be done, and you should be starting Schmidt. So therefore, that's it. And the Fridays are either a live stream once in a while, a live stream, or my messing around Fridays. My messing around on Friday afternoon. Okie dokie. Well, take care and bye bye. Have a good one.